lecture will be dedicated to the so-called artistic activism and its role in the public sphere, which is more or less following one of the recent books that Oliver Marchart published. It was the last one this year, called Conflictual Aesthetics, Artistic Activism and the Public Sphere, actually. And I think that this topicality has at least two very important dimensions for the local context here, because basically the lecturer is investigating different artistic practices, activist practices in the art field, in different genres, but at the same time I think emphasizing this activist undercurrent in the art field as such. I think it's very interesting from our perspective, first of all, because as we all know, and we also have some of the representatives of the respective generation who are here also in the audience, that basically we can say that in Ukraine so-called politically involved art emerged from the revolutionary experience, right? From basically the Orange Revolution of 2004. From that time on, we got several very important artistic activist groups in different cities in Ukraine. But the initial sparkle came from the political field as such, which is also very important. But secondly, Oliver Marchart will be also telling about the political potential of urban studies, of urbanism as such, but also of curating and the so-called what he names as biennials of resistance, which also reflects kind of our institutional modus operandi as the Kyiv biennial, which is totally self-organized, grassrooted, without any support from the, be it local or city or national authorities, of course. And it also somehow reflects the way how other biennials, representatives of which we also have here in the audience, act in their respective countries as well in the Eastern European region. So we will be especially interested in this point of the new type of the biennials, wave of which we also observe during the recent years in different parts of the world. So Oliver Marchart, as I mentioned, is a political theorist and philosopher, and he is currently professor of political theory at the University of Vienna, and he also worked at different other universities as well. I will mention just some of them at the University of Basel, at the University of Lucerne, and also at Kunstakademie Düsseldorf. And some of his most important books include post-foundational political thought, political difference in Nancy, Lefort, Badiou and Laclau of 2007, Thinking Antagonism, Political Ontology after Laclau of 2008, and Conflictual Aesthetics, the one that I already mentioned, which was published this year, and the next forthcoming book called Post-Foundational Theories of Democracy, Reclaiming Freedom, Equality and Solidarity. Please give our speaker a very warm welcome. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here. Can you hear me? Is that working? Okay. So, what I'm going to do basically is, in a first step, say something about activist art and basically about why the art field doesn't like it very much. In a second step, I will say something about the history of activist art, and I will try to make the point that it has always been with us, that artistic activism or political art, or however you want to call it, has always been part of the artistic production during the last 200 years or so. And then I will try to lay out the structural features of what makes art political, of what makes art activist. I'm not claiming that all art has to be activist. All art has to be activist art. I'm claiming that, or what I want to show is the features of activist art. So what are the structural features of activist art? And then if there is still enough time and if there are still people in the room, I will have a couple of pages on the philosophical underpinnings of that. But we will see whether we come to that. And what I wanted to show you are a couple of cases, because it makes it easier and you will see what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, we didn't find an adapter for the laptop, so I cannot show it to you. I will be describing what you would be seeing if if we had found an adapter. And I totally trust in the human faculty of imagination. So please, raise it up in your head. Now, at least since 2011, maybe for even a longer time, debates on activist art and political art resurfaced. They surfaced again within the art field. However, I'm a political scientist to some degree. Actually, I'm a philosopher, but I pretend being a political scientist at the political science department. And from the perspective of a political scientist, these debates within the art field, the debates about activist art, what it is not, actually tend to leave a very strange impression, because they illustrate the somewhat surreal character that political discussions frequently assume within the art world. And what I mean by that is that very often I can hardly detect the political content, or the political edge of that discussions in the art field. So when curators, artists, and those I will call in a moment art functionaries, talk about politics, I can hardly detect the politics in it very often. And that has to do with the fact, I think, that political art, actual political art or activist art practices do have a very bad reputation within the art field, which is a consequence of the fact that in the eyes of the functionaries of that field, every turn towards political activism is seen as a disturbance to the smooth functioning of the art field. So when I say the functionaries of the field, I don't mean this is in a mean way, or not in an entirely mean way. I am a functionary myself. I'm a functionary of my university, so there's nothing intrinsically bad about being a functionary. But what defines a functionary is the simple fact that the functionary is invested into the smooth and undisturbed functioning of his or her own institution. That's what defines a functionary. And there you see the problem that a functionary's investment of keeping out every disturbance. So that's in the nature, if you wish, of a functionary. And so when it comes to politics, politics as a rule disturbs the smooth functioning of institutions, the smooth functioning of processes or cycles of production, for instance. If you think of a labor strike, right, or of distribution, if you think of people blocking the roads, so they disturb the functioning of distribution, the distribution of goods within society, and they may also disturb the functioning of the smooth running of institutions, including art institutions. So wherever the political, in the largest sense, breaks in, there a space for maneuver opens up within the institutional framework of a given field, because things simply start functioning differently or not function not at all anymore. And all of a sudden, therefore, it becomes perceivable that things can be changed, that they may function differently, or that they may not function at all, which is a terrifying prospect in the mind of a functionary. And therefore, a peculiar ideology emerged, which proved most effective in gentrifying political art practices, in gentrifying activist art practices, or even in denying these practices any reason to exist in the first place. So there is a peculiar ideology, anti-political ideology, that has been evolved in the art field. And this ideology is structured around a paradoxical idea, we are told, by the functionaries. The idea that not that art, according to the functionaries, is unpolitical. That's not what they claim. What they claim is that art is political, but it is political, we are told, precisely in being not political. It is political only when it is not truly political. Because we are told art's true politics resides in its complexity, in its obliqueness, in its remoteness from every political practice in the strict sense. It is this trope, this idea of artistic complexity, which is part and parcel of that ideology. So, and the result of that is the less art is explicitly political, we are told, the more political it actually is, or is supposed to be. So, for that peculiar reason, we do not need explicitly political art. So you get this ideological syllogism. The idea, we are told, of this ideology in the mind of arts functionaries is that because art is always political, and art, if it's good art, has to be complex, it has to be oblique, it has to be unpenetrable, there always has to be a huge gap, the bigger the better, between art and its interpretation. Because if I can immediately grasp the meaning of an artwork, it's supposed to be a bad artwork. And a political artwork has to be understood. The meaning has to be grasped. So it must be a bad artwork for that reason. Contrary-wise, all art, simply by virtue of being complex, by virtue of being oblique, is political as such. And this trope, paradoxical as it sounds, has become common wisdom in the art field. And whenever consensus is threatened by political events or claims that are hard to digest from the perspective of a functionary, this wisdom is summoned up to defend the field's functioning against potential disturbances. So whenever it is demanded in a, say, we have a highly politicized situation somewhere, and whenever it is demanded in that situation that artists transform their practice into political action proper, immediately the counterclaim will be advanced from within the art field that politicization is unnecessary since art is in and by itself already political. And this unfounded claim of art's, you can say, primordial politicality, according to which art is always political, and therefore we do not need political art, that claim lies at the very heart of what I propose to call the spontaneous ideology of the art field. It is spontaneous to the extent to which it immediately comes to the mind of every functionary when confronted with activist practices. So it is a spontaneous ideology. And it is ideological, as it will become clear soon, not because certain truths about reality are concealed, but because the conflictual nature of the field on which art operates is concealed. The unrivaled master of this ideology of the functionaries is someone who is hugely prominent, the French philosopher Jacques Rancière, who, in my view, provides the spontaneous ideology of the art field with philosophical legitimacy. Because, as you may know, according to Rancière, art, already by virtue of being art, contributes to what he calls the redistribution of the sensible. And it is within that redistribution of the sensible where art's true politics resides, according to Rancière. To quote, He says the specificity of art consists in bringing about a reframing of material and symbolic space. And it is in this way that art bears upon politics. So art is political in reframing material and symbolic space. If this is the case, though, there is no need for explicitly political art anymore, let alone activist art. Because every artistic practice, of course, reframes material and symbolic space. Ergo, every art bears upon politics. Consequently, Rancière regularly expresses skepticism with regard to what he perceives as over-politicized artworks. Although Rancière's theory is widely read as a new approach to political aesthetics, in actual fact it is anti-political, as it provides the art field with ideological arguments against any explicit politicization. This appears to be the reason for the unrivaled success of his theory within the art field, as it allows for anti-political artists and anti-political curators to claim that what they produce or what they exhibit is political, even though it's entirely detached from any concrete political project that would threaten art's autonomy. In this way, one can capitalize both on the symbolic value of political art, while at the same time making the politicization of art impossible. And there are good reasons to believe that this trope of art being political by being unpolitical serves as a cover-up for the anti-political ideology of the proponents of the art field, who have come under pressure to defend business as usual against political factions within their own field, within the art field. While the anti-political worldview might be dominant, its hegemony is nonetheless contested. For what we can witness over the last years is a return of real politics, or more precisely, a turning toward real politics among many artists. This turn is not without consequences, however. A truly political art practice cannot be kept within the borders of a genre, such as political art or critical art, nor can it be kept within the walls of art institutions. Activist art practices are geared towards the political practices of, and I will claim in the course of my presentation, are geared towards political practices of organization, of agitation, and of propaganda. Practices, that is, of immersing oneself into the muddy waters of social struggle. What contemporary artists and activists therefore implicitly claim runs counter to the spontaneous ideology of the art field. Their claim is very simple. They claim if art is not political, then it's not political. And if one wants to increase art's politicality, one has to forge a passage towards politics. True politics, actual politics, not towards the representation of politics, not towards the mimicry of politics, but towards politics as a social practice with its own protocols that are not and cannot be entirely congruent with art, as defined by the functionaries of the art field. Activist practices within the art field teach us this simple lesson: art is political when it is political. It is not when it is not. So it's hardly surprising that this dissatisfaction with the anti-political bias of the art world peaks in moments of social crisis and political uproar. Without doubt, a new wave of activist institutional critique has emerged with 2011 Occupy Museums or Liberate Tate, calls for boycotting corporate art events from manifested tenants in Petersburg to the 2014 Sydney Biennial and others are spreading. As dissatisfaction with the art business increases, recent protests have made many artists turn towards more direct forms of action against or beyond art institutions. On closer inspection, however, it is hard not to realize that activist practices have been around much longer in the art field. And here starts the second part I have announced, which is a very short, basically, detour into art history. Totally superficial, though. And as I said, our activist art practices have gained visibility recently, but there is nothing particularly new to them. In fact, I submit that activist art practices have always been there as a sometimes more, sometimes less visible undercurrent of art in general. As you know, in the 1980s and 1990s, some of these practices made their way into the canon of contemporary art history under headings such as socially engaged art or participatory art or public art. Groups with which this historical moment is associated include, of course, the Guerrilla Girls, Grand Fury, Group Material, or the Women's Action Coalition. Yet their practice, the practice of the 80s and 90s, did not emerge from nowhere. It was built on the experience of the highly politicized 1960s and 1970s, on the times of counterculture, of feminist artists exploring the social function of reproductive labor, of the art workers' coalition struggling over labor conditions in the New York art field, and of highly politicized practices, for instance, in Latin America. So even though we tend to think of the 1960s and 1970s, given all these plethora of diverse activist practices, as the glorious decades of politicized art, it is also clear that, of course, as we all know, the first half of the 20th century was no less politicized. These were the decades when many artists were associated with the labor movements, when Dada turned red, as goes a fantastic book title, and when, for instance, the New York Dance League declared dance to be a weapon in the revolutionary class struggle. So the highly politicized moment of artistic practices. And the modernist penchant for political radicalism is well known, yet the phenomenon of artists siding with revolutionaries did not start with the 20th century either. So you see, I'm going backwards in history. The 19th century had already witnessed a plethora of activist artists and writers. Maybe one of the most sublime moments, one of the high point of artistic activism in the 19th century was reached when the realist painter Gustave Courbet and his comrades at the Paris Commune tore down the Vendôme column. Courbet's concept of revolutionary activism was modeled upon the example of the French revolutionary artists of 1789. And after its most prominent exponent in the visual arts, Jacques-Louis David, who had crossed the line, of course you all know him as a painter, but who has crossed the line between art and politics by becoming a member of the Jacobin Club and a political deputy. In a sense, this Davidian moment, when for the first time the passage was forged from art to politics as such, so an artist becoming a politician in the true sense of the term, this moment repeats itself whenever artists cross the line to politics and put their skills in the service of a common cause. So putting your skills in the service of something else, in the service of a common cause. And you may, in your mind, if not, I'm trying to describe it, know this famous poster of May 68 in France with the French letters that make the sentence l'art au service du peuple, so art in the service of the people. One of the famous posters of the May Paris, where l'art, the word art, and the letters of the word are arranged in the poster in the form of a hammer and a hand holding the hammer. So art becomes a hammer with which you can destroy something or you use it as a tool to do something with. So it is in the service of something else. It is not autonomous art in the service of art. It is art in the service of something else. So it is heteronymous art. If this Davidian moment, the moment when artists cross the line and become politicians, activists or party politicians, whatever, repeats itself with every instance of artistic activism, it would be wise to think of these instances not as isolated incidents. Practices of artistic activism are not confined to a supposedly political decade like the 1970s or the 1990s or period. Activist art is as old as the modern idea of art, of bourgeois art, which came to life with the bourgeois revolution, the revolution of 1789, and has to be carefully distinguished from heteronymous art as it was produced for the courts and the church in earlier times. From this revolutionary moment onwards, the moment of what Claude Lefort, the French theorist of democracy, called the Democratic Invention, a long historical stream of activist practices cutting through the conventional and commonsensical distinction of art and politics unfolded. Not that I would wish to deny the differences between historical cases of rebellious and revolutionary art. Of course, they are different all the time. But I would want to direct attention to the longue durée, the long time of artistic activism, the permanence of its differentiated practices. If we were to embark on the truly gigantic task of writing a history of political art, which amazingly does not exist. There are social histories of art, but there is not a history of political art. And this history would have to be conceived of as a political history of art. So the history of political art has to be a political history of art. It would have to be political for the simple reason that the art practices in question are, by virtue of being activist practices, essentially political practices. If, as I said, the Davidian moment repeats itself constantly, then it repeats itself as a political moment. This political moment is certainly as continuous as the moment of artistic activism, for the endless stream of activist art is hooked on an endless stream of protest. It would be wrong to assume that nothing political happened in between those grandiose events of protest, as they are symbolically condensed into magical numbers, such as 1789, 1848, 1871, 1917, 1956, 1968, 1998, and so on and so forth. You may add your own numbers. But social protest never disappeared in between these years. Instead, it moves in cycles between manifest and latent, that is, more and less visible phases. To merely focus on grandiose historical events would be entirely misleading. The occupations of 2011, for instance, like Occupy Wall Street, can be read as a second cycle of the global justice movement, whose manifest phase lasted from the mid-90s to the 9/11 crackdown. And even though a latent phase ensued, this in no sense implies that the movement had disappeared. Meetings were held, networks were built and kept being built, and protest formats developed that one could later on re-encounter in the occupations of 2011. Hence, the continuity of activist practices is punctuated by broadly visible events, but it is this continuity of practices that allows for the organization of these events in the first place. So where history is a constant stream of protests. Sometimes these protests are manifest and we see them on the streets. And sometimes they are present in a latent way as networks of activists, keeping in touch, of distributing their media, keeping their networks, but it's still there, maybe on a lower scale. Maybe from time to time they organize a demonstration. Maybe the demonstration doesn't work, nobody shows up. Nonetheless, there's protest. And then an explosion again, and things break out again, and it's suddenly visible. So let us now have a closer look, third part of my presentation, at the structural features of activist art practices. So what is it that makes activist art? Most people would spontaneously agree, as I said in the beginning, that the more complex, the more sophisticated, the more refined, the higher the quality of an artistic position. And vice versa, artistic positions which are or seem to be directly accessible and easy to decipher are perceived as more remote from art's essence. What we expect, after all, from a piece of art is some aura of the indecipherable, some mysterious distance between the work and the audience, some unbridgeable gap between art and interpretation. An artwork whose message appears immediately readable to everyone is considered a bad work by common standards. Yet these standards have not always been in place historically. They are upheld, reproduced, and disseminated by art institutions and their functionaries who adhere to the spontaneous ideology of their field. Given the value hierarchies of this field, it comes as no surprise that positions of explicitly political art are regularly denounced from within the art field as, and here it comes, mere propaganda. As Jonas Stahl, in a recent article, has observed, an article exactly on propaganda, you can find it on eFlux, there is something, quote, there is something deeply propagandistic in the disappearance of the notion of propaganda from artist discourse. So there's a paradox that there is a propaganda against propaganda within the art field. And the word, he goes on, the word propaganda only resurfaces bluntly to dismiss certain practices as one-dimensional, as pamphletism, or as ideological and doctrinal. But is propaganda, we may ask ourselves, really such a terrible thing? I would claim it is not, if we accept that political protocols will always be and have to be geared towards the reduction of complexity if a given struggle is to be successful. If you think, for instance, just of a political campaign, of course you can say, oh, politics simplifies things, that's a bad thing. But it's part of the game. So a political campaign needs to reduce complexity. Otherwise, it's not really political, and it must be readable to some extent. You must know what it is about. If you don't know what it is about, how can you decide whether you're for or against it? So propaganda, before anything else, is a way of making things politically readable by way of simplification. Even though simplification may be a no-go within sophisticated art circles, it is a necessary strategy of political articulation. It's a necessary strategy for politics. For at the end of the day, every political articulation confronts us with the exigency of a decision. Which side are you on? Are you, for instance, red or white, progressive or reactionary, pro or con? Are you part of the 1% or the 99%, the state or the people, the problem or the solution? In short, do you want to belong to us or to them? Political discourse is full of these tropes of decision. You have to make up your mind, are you for or against a candidate, for or against a cause, and so on. So we are always confronted with a stark choice, which is not always a pleasant choice, of course. But at the bottom line, every political act is premised on such fundamental choice, on a decision as to which side you are on. There cannot be politics without lines of demarcation being drawn. And propaganda is what one may think of as the arch technique of rhetorically drawing lines. Hence, there is no politics without a certain degree of propaganda involved. But the simplicity, and this point is very important to me and to my argument, the simplicity of the political terrain is a complex simplicity. Politics works on a terrain crisscrossed by multiple antagonisms, by multiple conflicts, multiple lines of conflicts which are crisscrossing the political terrain. Not a single one, except in extraordinary cases of civil war, for instance, where you may have only a single antagonism. But usually you have many antagonisms, many conflicts going on at the very same time. And if you compare this, what I call a complex simplicity, which is typical for politics, if we compare this to the idea of complexity within the art field, then we will realize that what artists, the functionaries of the art field, talk about is actually a very simplistic idea of complexity. A complexity devoid of any real internal contradictions and conflicts. In this amorphous complexity, as a rule, everything becomes interchangeable. Every so-called artistic position, interestingly, there is this lingo using the word position in the art field to markate a political artist's position in a totally unpolitical sense. So every so-called artistic position is without consequences and comes without a risk, because it can always be placed next to another position on the walls of a museum or in the gallery box or at an art fair. In this respect, the art field is ruled by the law of minimal differences, which amounts in the last instance to interchangeable trademarks. So you have, to be able to determine what in previous years one would have called an artist's handwriting, basically, and today you may call an artist's position, which is basically a trademark. It is not ruled, as politics is, by something completely different, which is the law of eventually incompatible and mutually exclusive decisions premised upon actual conflicts. And for this reason, the complexity of the autonomous artwork, praised by its defenders, is a fake complexity. Because true complexity emerges from irreconcilable conflicts which appear at the very same time and you don't know what to do. This is what makes a situation complex. And this will become evident if we compare such fake complexity with the kind of complexity produced by intersecting lines of conflict and political positioning. And here I would have shown you a work by Public Movement, Israeli performance collective, which is a totally simplistic work, typical for political art, totally simple, and at the same time very complex. Totally simple because what they do at a public square is they draw a line and they put the people on one or the other side of the line. And then they call out binary choices. For instance, male, female, left, right, politically speaking, Israel, Palestine. And people have to move to one or the other side, depending on with which side they identify with. But because these binary choices are added up on each other, people start moving back and forth. And they realize that their choices are not congruent with each other's. So what people realize is that if you make the choice left, right, many people may move to the left in most cases. And then you say Israel, Palestine, and you see how the left splits and people move to the side of Palestine and others move to the side of Israel. Which points to a real conflict, a real incommensurability, where two conflictual lines, two lines of conflicts intersect in a way which is not commensurable. And all our positions, and funnily the name of that piece is in fact positions in the plural, all our positions are incongruent to a certain degree and incompatible to a certain degree. Even my own political positions are incompatible if I think about it, if I start thinking about it. And I think this is what I call the complex simplicity of politics. It's basically simple because you have to take one or the other side, and at the very same time it's complex because it's not one choice you have to make many choices at the same time, and they are incompatible. So let us assume in another situation, and I give you a second example, another situation, a revolutionary situation, which shows that these lines of conflict, which make up the complex simplicity of the political terrain, in actual fact are not stable at all. They shift, they move, and therefore the things are even more complicated. the fact that these lines of conflicts are shifting and that a given position is open for reappropriation is what the Egyptian graffiti artist Gansier experienced when he started putting his political murals onto the streets of Cairo in 2011. His initial motivation was, as he himself says, to leave some kind of mark in the area in the sense of, and these are his words, counter-propaganda. But soon it turned out that this mark, in actual fact, became a moving target, as in the case of a piece or work of graffiti, which would become famous indeed, that portrayed a tank moving towards a lone biker, which is obviously anti-regime, anti-military regime statement. But then it starts moving in a political sense. As Gansier recounts, quote, "A few months after I painted it, protesters were attacked by the military in front of the television center. So another artist updated my work by drawing a lot of demonstrators in front of the tank, some of them being run over by it. Once again, other people came and painted over everything except the tank itself, which now stood completely alone. They wrote something next to it along the lines of 'the people and the army hand in hand,' thus turning it into a pro-military work. Shortly after that, some other artists came along and painted a big military monster eating people right next to the tank. So it switched back to being an anti-military piece again." So what one can learn from this story is that the ability to fix, right, or fixing a political position once and for all is not in our own hands. We cannot fix our political positions because we are not the only ones who are work on that positions. It's a collective enterprise. People may reappropriate it, turn it into the opposite, and then we again try to turn it around again. A line of demarcation can be redefined. A position may shift back and forth because the terrain of politics, to the extent that it is governed by actual contradictions, not fake contradictions, is a deeply unstable terrain shaken by real antagonisms. What we need, therefore, is what I call a conflictual aesthetics. And in my book, Vasil referred to, I try to lay out basically the contours of such a conflictual aesthetics, which is an aesthetics which is conflictual in a double sense. It conflicts with the aesthetics of the spontaneous ideologies of the art field. So let's say the aesthetics of autonomous art, but also the aesthetics of simplistic complexity. And it seeks to work out the political implications of conflictual artistic practice. So it is in this double sense both a conflicting aesthetics and an aesthetics of conflicts. It conflicts, it opposes aesthetics, but it is an aesthetics of conflict. And let me return to the questions of art as propaganda to lay out where I think basically the key moments of such an aesthetics lie, and see how it fits into a conflictual aesthetics. And these moments, I think, are the moments of propagating, agitating, and organizing as three interconnected ways of rehearsing conflict or rehearsing antagonism. And let me, in this final part, because I decided to skip the philosophical part, let me in this final part of the paper start with addressing a misconception about propaganda. A very, very common misconception. The misconception that propaganda is essentially about manipulation, fooling people, which is deeply rooted in our common sense, but also rooted in the paradigm of conventional ideology critique, and also in the paradigm of the spontaneous ideology of the art field. But maybe we could think about propaganda differently. Maybe a different picture emerges when we start appreciating that propaganda has not always been a negative term, a pejorative term, that is synonymous with deception. One should remember that, interestingly, communist parties used the term in the affirmative. With their propaganda, what they meant, what communists meant, contrary to actually what Goebbels meant and his ministry of propaganda, as far as I can tell, was not to fool people into a manipulated view of reality. Propaganda, as a technical term, straightforwardly referred to the dissemination of the correct view of reality. Of course, the correct view of reality as approved by the party and, scientifically guaranteed by the historical doctrine of Marxist economics and dialectical materialism. But from there on, you come to what you consider, being a good communist, as the correct view of reality. And this straightforward sense of propaganda, understood not as a manipulated, but as the only correct view of reality, right? I am propagating the correct view. I don't want to manipulate you. I propagate the correct view of what I consider to be the correct view, obviously. This idea of propaganda can be traced back to the very moment when the term came to life in the year 1622 with the papal foundation of a committee of cardinals named the Congregatio de Propaganda Fide by the Catholic Church. And the committee, as the name says, was charged with the propagation of the faith. Of course, Catholic faith. And Catholicism is the only true religion in the sense of that's what Catholics think, right? So it was the propagation of the correct faith, the only true faith. The Church was deeply convinced of the superior truth of its doctrine, and nonetheless, and that's the irony, a propaganda committee was still deemed necessary in the first place to transmit that truth, because obviously the truth and the true ideas about the world does not transmit itself automatically. You have to do something. So it has to enter a contested space where rival faiths and rival discourses may equally be propagated. The same holds for today's artistic practices, where they aim at making a decentral political point, where they dissent or protest, no matter whether they consider themselves to be in possession of a correct view of reality or rather take a more self-critical stance. They will have to propagate their view against competing forces, some of which will be very strong, very dominant, very hegemonic. Therefore, the terrain that they enter will always be dominated and preformed by some kind of congregatio de propaganda fide, by the state or by the ruling powers. And to engage with hegemonic views may necessitate the construction of a counter-hegemonic political project, and consequently the propagation of counter-propaganda, understood as a particular kind of propaganda, maybe a minoritarian propaganda if you wish, directed against the doxa defined by the hegemonic forces of propaganda fide. And you may think about today's Congregatio de Propaganda Fide as, for instance, all the neoliberal economists in the universities or their right hands in the newspapers, disseminating and propagating the true faith of capitalism. That's a Congregatio de Propaganda Fide. But to counter that, you need counter propaganda. It's not enough to say they are wrong. It's not the truth. I have the truth. You have to do something to propagate your truth. So given what has been said so far, we must not be afraid of the term propaganda, even though it is given a bad reputation by the functionaries of the art field. Every piece of knowledge we can gain, every truth and every correct worldview we may achieve in the field of politics will have to be propagated against rival truths and worldviews. The fact that every political position will have to be propagated by a hegemonic project, hegemonic or hegemony here being defined by Ernesto Laclau as the process whereby a partial force assumes the role of a universal actor, so it means you universalize your own political position or try to universalize it. becomes, so the fact that every political position will have to be propagated becomes immediately clear if the etymology of propaganda is considered. Originally, to propagate means to procreate, to broaden, to enlarge. In this sense, it's possible, for instance, to speak of the propagation of a dominion, which simply means to extend a given domain of political rule. So the technical term for that is propagation. And this is also what hegemony is about, the extension of a particular position to an apparently universal one. Firstly, propaganda needs to be accompanied, but then propaganda needs to be accompanied by a second moment, which is agitation. There's no propaganda without, or no successful propaganda without agitation. During revolutionary times, the political strategy of agitation was, at the time of the Russian Revolution, considered a necessary supplement of propaganda. The function of agitation was not to promote the correct view of reality, but to stir up unrest, to unsettle certainties, and to wake up people from their dogmatic slumber. I could show you now many examples for that, but I cannot show you. To agitate means to work actively on the disaffiliation of people from the realm of doxa, from their dogmatic slumber, from what is considered to be true faith in the hegemonic sense. Therefore, the precondition of successful propaganda is successful agitation. If propaganda is, in its essence, about getting people connected with the correct view of reality, then agitation is about disconnecting them from doxa. What I mean by doxa is the taken for granted assumptions of common sense, of commonsensical ideology, Like neoliberalism has become common sense in some quarters of society. It's not questioned anymore. It has become doxa. In political art, such moments of agitation can be discerned regularly because agitation proceeds by way of irritation, and art is always good in irritating our dogmatic beliefs. Maybe art is even best at irritating our dogmatic beliefs. And there is a third strategy, which is of key importance, which is organization. And here, maybe the question of the biennials of resistance come into view, even though I'm not going to say very much about that. But biennials, of course, are platforms which, depending on whether they are very successful, very huge, very prominent, and therefore well-funded or not, nonetheless, they are platforms in a symbolic sense, in an organizational, institutional sense. I've been working for... I was working for Documenta 11, the one created by Oki and Vesor and a couple of other people. And Documenta 11 was very important and instrumental in shifting the perspective of the art field towards non-Western art. And that was only possible because of the organizational and institutional power of such a huge institution of Documenta. If you do that, in a place like this, no offense, but nobody will care really. Yeah? If you do this in one of the 2 or 3 most important biennials, where all the art journalists go to see what's going to happen, you can really make an impact. So institution is very important, but I'm not making a claim that you can only do it in big institutions, because you have to start somewhere. And this is where biennials of resistance come into view. I would make the more complicated claim, maybe we can discuss this later, that even a huge biennial like the Documenta can be a biennial of resistance, which is basically a term coined by Nanji Toscote. It's not my own term, biennial of resistance. But there are peripheral biennials. There are much less funded biennials, which can, of course, in a different way, also provide the terrain for a shift in perspective, provided, as I said, they seek to propagate their view. They are seeking to expand rather than being content with what they have. So let me come to this third and last strategy, which I think for activist art practices is of key importance, which is organization. The Dmitry Vilensky once, in a reflection on what it means to run a newspaper as an art project, quoted from Lenin's 1901 article, Where to Begin. And for Lenin it was clear that a newspaper, because this is all about what it means to run a newspaper in the art field, well, for Dmitry Vilensky in the art field, for Lenin perhaps not. So, but what Lenin said is, it's clear that a newspaper is not only a collective propagandist and collective agitator, but also a collective organizer. So you have these three things now involved. Here, eventually, we have the completed trias of revolutionary activity: agitating, propagating, organizing. Or as I would translate it into a more common language, or more nowadays language, disrupting, expanding, and instituting. Vilensky leaves no doubt that the last term, the dimension of organization or institution, is of key importance. A newspaper is a means of constructing a collectivity around instituting practices. It's not simply a medium. It's a mean of constructing a collectivity around instituting practices, of organizing not only an editorial collective, but also a whole network of people, a network of practices and debates. The activity of publishing a newspaper has to be, quote, embedded in an array of other mediums and productions. For otherwise, the power of the newspaper may be limited to a rather simple gesture, impotent to represent anything but itself. So here you see what an organization is, or an institution is, such as a newspaper, is not what you may think of it. In the same sense, a biennial is not simply a place to show art. It is, as he describes the newspaper, a means of organization, a means of organizing people, of organizing discourses, of trying to institute these discourses, of bringing people together, of creating a network. But if it is supposed to be political, you can do this in all, of course, artists always do that anyway. But if you want to do it in a political way, then of course it has to have a purpose, right? So you have to propagate something, you have to agitate with some ideas in mind. So there has to be some political project attached to it, to whatever degree. And these considerations are, I submit, substantial enough to lead us to the following conclusion, and with that I would like to finish my presentation. A position in which art connects to politics must be informed by the triple strategy of agitation, propaganda, and organization. Without prior disruption of common opinion, that is, without agitation, the chances of propaganda succeeding are small. But without the propagation, that is, the expansion of a particular position to a more hegemonic one, no effect, no sustainable effect, no sustainable political effect will be produced at all. A given artist-activist performance will disappear in a second, like a flash mob. And without the dimension of organization, the propagation of a particular position will not be sustainable either, as debates and practices have to be organized in order to survive over time. They have to a certain extent to be institutionalized. And these are the key strategies I find in activist practices, and I can describe, and I could have shown you a couple of examples, but I could go on at least speaking about examples in order to put some flesh on these bones, but I would